Section 24 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Dar'Keith Lofton. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Mendoza settles Buenos Aires. A.D. 1535. Robert Salvi. By the discovery in 1515 of the Rio de la Plata, River of Silver, the Spaniards opened for themselves a way to colonization in South America. The first explorer, Juan Diaz de Solis, was killed by the Indians on landing from the river. But in 1519, Magellan, while on his great voyage of circumnavigation, visited the Plata, and in 1526, Sebastian Cabot, in the service of Charles I of Spain, the Emperor Charles V, ascended the river to the junction of the Paraguay and the Paraná, both of which he then explored for a long distance. It was not long, however, before a somewhat extensive settlement in those parts was projected. Don Pedro Mendoza, a knight of Guadix, Granada, one of the royal household, undertook the colonization of the country, and September 1st, 1534, he sailed from San Lucar. Mendoza had enriched himself at the sackage of Rome by the Constable de Bourbon in 1527. Ill-gotten wealth had been so often ill-expended as to have occasioned proverbs in all languages. The plunder of Rome did not satisfy him, and dreaming of other Mexicos and Cuscos, he obtained a grant of all the country from the River Plata to the Straits, to be his government, with permission to proceed across the continent to the South Sea. He undertook to carry out in 2 voyages, and within 2 years, 1,000 men, 100 horses, and stores for 1 year at his own expense, the king granting him the title of Adelantado, with 2,000 more from the fruits of the conquest in aid of his expenses. He was to build 3 fortresses, and be perpetual alcalde of the first. His heirs after him were to be first alguazils of the place where he fixed his residence, and after he had remained 3 years, he might transfer the task of completing the colonization and conquest either to his heir or any other person whom it might please him to appoint, and with it the privileges annexed, if within 2 years the king approved the choice. A king's ransom was now understood to belong to the crown, but as a further inducement, this prerogative was waived in favor of Mendoza and his soldiers, who were to share it, first having deduced the royal 5th and then a 6th. If, however, the king in question were slain in battle, half the spoils should go to the crown. These terms were made in wishful remembrance of the ransom of Atahualpa. He was to take with him a physician, an apothecary, and a surgeon, and especially 8 religioners. Life is lightly hazarded by those who have nothing more to stake, but that a man should, like Mendoza, stake such riches as would content the most desperate life gambler for his winnings is one of the many indications how generally and how strongly the contagious spirit of adventure was at that time prevailing. Mendoza had covenanted to carry 500 men in his first voyage. Such was his reputation and such the ardor of going to the Silver River that more adventurers offered than it was possible for him to take, and he accelerated his departure on account of the enormous expense which such a host occasioned. The force with which he set forth consisted of 11 ships and 800 men. So fine an armament had never yet sailed from Europe to America, but they who beheld this departure are said to have remarked that the service of the dead ought to be performed for the adventurers. They reached Rio de Janeiro after a prosperous voyage, and remained there a fortnight, during which time the Adelantado, being crippled by a contraction of the sinews, appointed Juan Osorio to command in his stead. Having made his arrangement, they proceeded to their place of destination, anchored at Isle St. Gabriel within the Plata, and then on its southern shore and beside a little river. There, Don Pedro de Mendoza laid the foundation of a town which, because of its healthy climate, he named Nuestra Señora de Buenos Aires, Our Lady of Good Air. It was not long before he was made jealous of Osorio by certain envious officers and, weakly lending ear to wicked accusations, he ordered them to fall upon him and kill him, then drag his body into the plaza or public marketplace and proclaim him a traitor. The murder was perpetrated, and thus was the expedition deprived of one who was described as an honest and generous good soldier. Experience had not yet taught the Spaniards that any large body of settlers in a land of savages must starve unless well supplied with food from other sources until they can raise it for themselves. The Carandis, who possessed the country round about this new settlement, were a wandering tribe who, in places where there was no water, quenched their thirst by eating a root which they called cardes, or by sucking the blood of the animals which they slew. About 3,000 of these savages had pitched their movable dwellings some 4 leagues from the spot which Mendoza had chosen for the site of his city. They were well pleased with their visitors, and during 14 days brought fish and meat to the camp. On the 15th day they failed, and Mendoza sent a few Spaniards to them to look for provisions, who came back empty-handed and wounded. Upon this, he ordered his brother Don Diego, with 300 soldiers and 30 horsemen, to storm their town and kill or take prisoner the whole horde. The Carandis had sent away their women and children, collected a body of allies, and were ready for the attack. Their weapons were bows and arrows and targes, stone-headed tridents about half the length of a lance. Against the horsemen they used a long thong, having a ball of stone at either end. With this they were wont to catch their game, throwing it with practiced aim at the legs of the animal it coiled round and brought it to the ground. In all former wars with the Indians, the horsemen had been the main strength and often the salvation of the Spaniards. This excellent mode of attack made them altogether useless. They could not defend themselves. The commander and 6 hidalgos were thrown and killed, and the whole body of horse must have been cut off if the rest had not fled in time and been protected by the infantry. About 20 foot soldiers were slain with targes, but it was not possible that these people, brave as they were, could stand against European weapons and such soldiers as the Spaniards. They gave way at last, leaving many of their brethren dead, but not a single prisoner. The conquerors found in their town plenty of flour, fish, what is called fish butter, which probably means inspissated oil, otter skins, and fishing nets. They left 100 men to fish with these nets, and the others returned to the camp. Mendoza was a wretched leader for such an expedition. He seems, improvidently, to have trusted to the natives for provision and to have quarreled with them unnecessarily. Very soon after his arrival, 6 ounces of bread had been the daily allowance. It was now reduced to 3 ounces of flour, and every 3rd day, a fish. They marked out the city and began a mud wall for its defense, the height of a lance and 3 feet thick. It was badly constructed. What was built up one day fell down the next. The soldiers had not as yet planned this part of their duties. A strong house was built within the circuit for the adelantado. Meantime, their strength began to fail for want of food. Rats, snakes, and vermin of every eatable size were soon exterminated from the environs. 3 men stole a horse and ate it. They were tortured to make them confess the fact and then hanged for it. Their bodies were left upon the gallows, and in the night all the flesh below the waist was cut away. 1 man ate the corpse of his brother. Some murdered their messmates for the sake of receiving their rations as long as they could conceal their death by saying they were ill. The mortality was very great. Mendoza, seeing that all must perish if they remained here, sent George Lucian, one of his German or Flemish adventurers, up the river with 4 brigantines to seek for food. Whenever they came, the natives fled before them and burned what they could not carry away. Half the men were famished to death, and all must have perished if they had not fallen in with a tribe who gave them barely enough maize to support them during their return. The Karandis had not been dismayed by one defeat. They prevailed upon the Bartenas, the Sechuas, and the Timbuas to join them, and with a force which the besieged in their fear estimated at 23,000, thought it did not properly amount to a third of that number, suddenly attacked the new city. The weapons which they used were not less ingeniously adapted to their present purpose than those which had proved so effectual against the horse. They are said to have had arrows which took fire at the point as soon as they were discharged, which were not extinguished until they had burned out, and which kindled whatever they touched. With these devilish instruments they set fire to the thatched huts of the settlers and consumed them all. The stone house of the Adelantado was the only dwelling which escaped destruction. At the same time, and with the same weapons, they attacked the ships and burned 4. The other 3 got to a safe distance in time and at length drove them off with their artillery. About 30 Spaniards were slain. The Adelantado now left a part of his diminished force in the ships to repair the settlement, giving them stores enough to keep them from starving for a year, which they were to eke out as best they could, he himself advancing up the river with the rest in the brigantines and smaller vessels. But he deputed his authority to Juan de Ayolas, being utterly unequal to the fatigue of command. In fact, he was, at this time, dying of the most loathsome and dreadful malady that human vices have ever yet brought upon human nature. About 84 leagues up the river they came to an island inhabited by the Timbuas, who received them well. Mendoz presented their chief, Sechera Wasu, with a shirt, a red cap, an axe, and a few other trifles, in return for which he received fish and game enough to save the lives of his people. The tribe trusted wholly to fishing and to the chase for food. They used long canoes. The men were naked and ornamented both nostrils with stones. The women wore a cotton cloth from the waist to the knee, and cut beauty slashes in their faces. Here the Spaniards took up their abode, and named the place Buena Esperanza, signifying good hope. One Gonzalo Romero, who had been one of Cabot's people and had been living among the savages, joined them here. He told them they were large and rich settlements of the country, and it was thought advisable that Ayolas should proceed with the brigantines in search of them. Meantime, Mendoza, who was now become completely crippled, returned to Buenos Aires, where he found a great part of his people dead, and the survivors struggling with famine and every species of wretchedness. They were relieved by the arrival of Gonzalo Mendoza, who, at the beginning of their distresses, had been dispatched to the coast of Brazil in quest of supplies. Part of Cabot's people, after the destruction of his settlement, had sailed for Brazil and established themselves in a bay called Igua, 24 leagues from St. Vicente. There, they began to form plantations and continued 2 years on friendly terms with the adjoining natives and the Portuguese. Disputes then arose, and, according to the Castilian account, for no other remains, the Portuguese resolved to fall upon them and drive them out of the country. Of this they obtained intelligence, surprised the intended invaders, plundered the town of St. Vicente, and, being joined by some discontented Portuguese from that infant colony, sailed in 2 ships for the island of St. Catalina. There, these adventurers began a new settlement, but such was their restless spirit that, when Gonzalo Mendoza arrived there, they were easily persuaded to abandon the houses which they had just constructed, and the fields which were now beginning to afford them comfortable subsistence. And the whole colony, with their 2 ships, joined him and made for the Plata, to partake in the conquests and spoils of the Silver River. They brought a considerable supply of stores, and were themselves well armed and well supplied with ammunition. Some Brazilian Indians with their families accompanied them, and they themselves, being accustomed to the language and manners of the natives, were of the most essential service to the adventurers with whom they joined company. At sight of this seasonable relief, Mendoza returned thanks to God, shedding tears of joy. He waited a while in hopes of hearing good tidings from Ayolas, and at length sent Juan de Salazar with a second detachment in quest of him. His health grew daily worse, and his hopes fainter. He had lost his brother in this expedition and expended above 40,000 ducats of his substance, nor did there appear much probability of any eventual success to reimburse him. So he determined to sail for Spain, leaving Francisco Royts to command at Buenos Aires, and appointing Ayola's governor if he should return, and Salazar in case of his death. His instructions were that, as soon as either of them should return, he was to examine what provisions were left, and allow no rations to any persons who could support themselves, nor to any women who were not employed in either washing or in some other such necessary service, that he should sink the ships or dispose of them in some other manner, and, if he thought fit, proceed across the continent to Peru, where, if he met with Pizarro and Almagro, he was to procure their friendship in the Adelantado's name, and if Almagro should be disposed to give him 150,000 ducats for a resignation of his government, as he had given to Pedro de Alvarado, he was to accept it, or even 100,000, unless it should appear more profitable not to close with such an offer. How strong must his hope of plunder have been after 4 years of continued disappointment and misery! Moreover, he charged his successor, if it should please God to give him any jewel or precious stone, not to omit sending it to him, as some help in his trouble. And he instructed him to form a settlement on the way to Peru, either upon the Paraguay or elsewhere, from whence tidings of his proceedings might be transmitted. Having left these directions, Mendoza embarked, still dreaming of gold and jewels. On the voyage, they were so distressed for provisions that he was obliged to kill a favorite bitch which had accompanied him through all his troubles. While he was eating this wretched meal, his senses failed him. He began to rave, and died in the course of 2 days. End of section 24.